All right. So we'll go ahead and get started again. It is right at 10 o'clock. So what I forgot to mention whenever I did my introduction is that this program is in partnership with the Iberia African American Historical Society, and it's also in partnership with the Louisiana Endowment of the Humanities and the state of Louisiana. So we were able to offer this program for free to everyone here through these various partnerships that we have in support. And our next speaker is the president of the Iberia African American Historical Society. On your schedule, you saw that she was supposed to have a co-presenter, Dr. Mark Guidry. He had to have emergency dental surgery this week, so he was unable to join us today, but we're going to do our best to make sure that he can make it down to come and speak to us at some point. Dr. Guidry is doing some really amazing work with the St. Augustine Historical Society up in Natchitoches with the St. Augustine Catholic Church. So Phoebe is going to talk with us about the work that the Iberia African American Historical Society is doing here in Iberia Parish with descendant and community churches. So Dr. Phebe Hayes.
You know, one of the things I've been accused of is I'll spend time trying to organize notes so that so that I don't go off topic and spend more time than I'm allotted. But Adam assures me he has a huge sign reminding me when it's time to shut up. Okay. So, but thank you all so much. And I do again want to thank the Shadows and the National Trust and the Louisiana Endowment for the Humanities for bringing all of this together and bringing us together. This is an important topic. And as someone who has grown up here all her life and who is a descendant of the people who were enslaved on these area plantations and who brought a lot of wealth to this community, I am passionate about telling the true and inclusive story of the people, all the people in this area. When you talk about people, you're talking about all those things that matter to them: their religion, the traditions that brought them, that made their religious practices unique. And so because I grew up in a community like that, my ancestors started out Roman Catholic, which I'll talk a little bit about later on, but they also became Protestant following emancipation. They became Baptists, the majority. They became Methodists. They became Congregationalists. And these little churches, many of them still exist here in Iberia Parish. And it's important to me that we preserve those churches, if not the physical churches, then at least the memory, the existence of those churches through whatever means are possible, whatever means are necessary. So again, thank you all for coming. I want to tell you a little bit about, well, let me first tell you what I plan to do. I didn't tell you it's always going to happen, but what I plan to do. I plan to first talk about why we need to study these local churches. What do they bring to the table? How do they advance our understanding of the local history? Because that's what I'm mostly concerned about. I learned as a child U.S. history as it was taught, which I know now was incomplete and sometimes just downright wrong. But I also know that wherever national history occurred in these local communities, it also occurred. Here in Iberia Parish, Civil War unfolded. Never knew that. Didn't understand the impact of the occupation of Iberia Parish on all the citizens, Black and white, in this community. And you know how I found out? By pulling, first of all, remembering the stories of the people that I grew up, hearing, like my ancestors, my grandparents, my parents, but pulling the pension records of my ancestral grandfathers who were Civil War veterans and listening, reading their words, reading the stories of how they left New Iberia under the protection of the federal troops with their families. And then they enlisted in the Union Army or the Union Navy. And that was empowering for me to see my people as being multidimensional Because one thing that history does is it has dehumanized the people that I come from. We become things, we become objects in a lot of the tellings of the history of people in these little local communities. So that's one of my missions, is to talk about my ancestors, talk about the people that formed the communities that my ancestors lived in and their motivations. So I don't want to knock this over. So why study these churches, these local churches? First of all, they are primary documentation of the history of Iberia Parish. And for most of you who know the kind of work that we do through the Iberia African American Historical Society, that's our mission. Our mission is to research, teach, preserve, and commemorate the history of the Africans and their descendants in this community, because it's never been done before. So it's to make our story included in the official historical record of the area. When these little churches were founded, sometimes during slavery, sometimes immediately after the slavery period ended, they were founded in areas where Blacks who were newly freed gathered for protection, but also because they were able to work near the fields that they still had to work on, but this time for wages, right? So a lot of these churches, for example, in Iberia, we have a historically Black community called the Nico Town community. We have the Black community, Black neighborhood of Patouville, of Olivia, Louisiana, of Freetown, of Lauraville, all these little, in Blufftown, all these little communities, I can't forget Morbihan. All these little communities, they had a couple of things in common. They had churches, because that's the first thing that these community members did after they built homes. They built churches. And then some of those churches, because these leaders of these churches, they collaborated or cooperated with the Freedmen's Bureau, they also built schools or held schools in these little rural churches. Now, the churches I'm talking about, when I'm talking about those little rural churches, usually wooden white churches, sometimes with a simple little steeple and a little cross. And beside it or behind it, a cemetery. And it's interesting to me that the architecture of those churches is so similar in this area, these southern churches. They're so very similar. Very seldom do you find 19th century, early 20th century Black churches being built of brick or stone, at least in this area. Of course, the problem with that is we have hurricanes. Hurricanes tend to knock wooden buildings down. So that accounts for some of the losses that we are now seeing. My concern as representing our historical society has always been, what happens if we allow these churches to disappear? The churches that we have been studying have served as the anchors of these little Black communities. My ancestors were, on the maternal side, came from the Nico Town area. A lot of them were sugarcane farmers after the war and after they began to amass property. The only way you would know where the Nico Town community is because there's a little church in that area on Manual Road. It's a beautiful little church. And I apologize, I just didn't have time to pull pictures together. But it's a little church and the cemetery is directly behind it. And of course, all the people I come from on my maternal side, many of them are buried there. So I can walk among those tombstones and I can see my ancestors and my related relatives. Another little church there is called Zion Travelers Baptist Church. And for those of you who are from Iberia Parish, you probably know where that church is, at the corner of Darnell Road and Admiral Doyle. It's a little church that sits kind of on a hill. It's a beautiful piece of property. And I'll tell you more about that little church in a bit. These churches are disappearing. With our Descendant Churches initiative that we have assumed as our responsibility to create, we want to preserve as much of these churches as we can, preserve their history. So we may not be able to preserve the physical buildings, as we say, but we can at least preserve the evidence of these churches having existed. And that's what's important for us. Avery Island, for example, has a church, or had a church called Emmanuel Baptist Church. That little church had a cornerstone. We found an article where it showed that the article stated in newspapers.com, over 700 people traveled from all around by wagon, carriage, mules, on horseback, and some walked to witness the laying of the cornerstone of that church. It no longer exists. And I've had the opportunity, because of a friend who is the historian at Avery Island, to actually see that church before it finally collapsed because it was damaged by 2 hurricanes. The first hurricane didn't collapse it totally. The second hurricane did. All that's left of that church are the cornerstones and the bell. And one of them is in the museum out on Avery Island, and the other one is in, I think, a private home. But the point is, that's the only evidence we have that that church ever existed. The only evidence we have that Blacks actually lived on the island itself as a community. They live around the island, but not on the island as a community. So we feel that it's important for us to preserve the story, the history of these little church communities. When you look at who founded these churches, you get even more information about the history of this region. Now, it's interesting because it's very difficult sometimes to find the original church charters. A lot of them did not have charters from the 19th century. Some of them I was able to find. For example, Zion Travelers Baptist Church, their charter, they were chartered in 1872, I think it is. But they were like Reconstruction and a little bit post-Reconstruction era churches. Star Temple Baptist Church, I think Dr. Furstel and I were talking about that little church founded around the Koto area, predominantly Black church. It was founded in 1869. Star Pilgrim Baptist Church, which is just a few blocks away from us, was founded in 1869. And you have to understand too, when you trace the existence of these churches and the time period in which they were raised, then you have an opportunity to really understand the context, the political, the social context in which these churches were founded. Reconstruction in Iberia Parish was not a pretty time. It was all about violence, voter suppression, through violence, through lynchings, through beatings, through massacres. I had someone that tell me that she was so happy that we lived in Iberia because none of these kinds of things happened, because there was no lynching and there was no and I'm going, you see, that's what happens when we're not taught our history, because we were not any better than any other Jim Crow or former Confederate community. To enforce the laws, to make sure that Black men, even though they were constitutionally given the right to vote, to make sure that they did not exercise that right along with their allies, those radical Republicans. They were threatened. They were forced to either vote on that Democratic ticket, which was a different Democratic Party, as you all know, because it was the party of the former Confederates. It was the party of the segregationists. So if they went to the polls and they dared to vote as Republicans, they were beaten or they were threatened. The best that happened is they would lose their jobs instead of their lives, or they were expelled from the community, because the forces that be in the community, they wanted to make sure that that supremacy that they relied on to control the community continued to exist. And well, we're not going to get into present politics. So again, history has a way of teaching us. It has a way of helping us. If we look all around us, we can see evidence of the history that existed in the 19th century, and sometimes it continues to inform us in the 20th and the 21st centuries. When people, the enslaved humans, during slavery period, when they wanted to practice religion in Louisiana, most of you know this, the Catholic Church exerted a lot of control. So many of the people that I come from, they exited slavery as Roman Catholics. So many of my family members, they were members of St. Peter's Catholic Church here in New Iberia, St. Joseph in Laurelville. There was no Black Catholic parish at all. And they, even then, as I was told, and as I now I know, because I've read this, they had to they had to sit in certain places in the churches. For example, the balconies at St. Peter. And in other churches, there wasn't a balcony, but there was a set of seats that were reserved for the Africans who attended service there. They could not take communion at the same time that the white parishioners were able to take their communion. The other thing that a lot of people aren't aware of in this area, a lot of those Black Catholics, they're buried in those what are considered to be historically white cemeteries, like St. Peter's Catholic Church. Many or several of my ancestors are buried at St. Peter's, but I've never actually seen many Blacks in the St. Peter's Cemetery, during All Saints, putting the flowers on the tombs, etc. But there are many Blacks that are buried there, including several of my family members. Not only St. Peter's, but Lydia, the church, St. Nicholas in Lydia, Louisiana. Now, the church in Laurelville, they have a cemetery that was for Blacks, but their cemetery was segregated. St. Peter's Cemetery was not, and the St. Nicholas Cemetery was not. But that's the history of Catholicism in Iberia Parish. In 1917, when St. Edward's Parish was formed as a Black parish, then of course all the Blacks who were members of the white Catholic churches were expelled so that they could go to church in the Black parish. And again, that was something that I don't think it was, and John, you can correct me. I don't think it was something that they did voluntarily, leaving their church, but they were forced to leave the church and to go to their own parish. After emancipation, a lot of the Blacks from this area, they left the Catholic faith. Again, my roots are Catholic, once my people came to this country by force. My roots are Catholic, but once they became free people of color, most of them converted to Protestant religions, like mostly Baptist, Methodist, Congregationalist, and many of them continue to follow those particular faiths. The Catholic Church, though, provided a lot of information that people like me find valuable, like Father Hebert's Southwestern Louisiana Catholic Church records. For those of you who do a lot of genealogy, I found so much information about my ancestors through that collection of material. Like when my people were born, they were christened or baptized in St. Peter's Catholic Church. Their records appear. Their records appear in some of the other Catholic Church or associated with some of the other Catholic Church records. When they died, their burial records are also available or documented, indexed in Father Hebert's records. So the Iberia African American Historical Society, we recognize the importance of documenting, preserving these historical churches. And we also understand that we can't do much of anything to keep them from disappearing totally. But we can, as I said, preserve their memory and provide documentation. So one of the things that we decided to do this year was to, and actually, I'm sorry, it was last year, we have what's called the Descendant Churches Initiative. And the purpose of that is to work with church communities to basically do an inventory of who's in the church and to get the church members to understand that their churches are in danger. Because as an example, if you go into one of these little churches, you'll see a lot of people who are elderly, my age and older. You see very few young people, very few children. Well, that's the definition of a dying church because there is no future church on the horizon. So we try to get them to understand the importance of preserving their records. One church here in New Iberia, which is a wonderful church, It was the St. Paul Congregational Church. It was founded, probably the oldest congregational church in Louisiana. It was founded by the Congregational Church of America, and it came about as a result of the missionaries from that denomination coming to Iberia Parish and establishing the St. Paul Congregational Church. That church figured prominently in the Reconstruction era. It figured prominently in a lot of the violence, a lot of the activities that were going on in the 1860s and 1870s. I should say 1870s and 1880s. I refer to it as a warrior church. In 1889, there was a child who was lynched right on Main Street, Sammy Wakefield. And I say he was a child because Sammy was about 17 or 18 years old. His sister has a marker that we placed in the same area, commemorating her as Louisiana's first woman to get a medical degree and also the first Black woman to actually practice medicine here. But when Sammy was lynched, and I don't mean hung, vigilante justice, he supposedly killed a white man, and there was a mob. There was a group of vigilantes, regulators, they called themselves, who captured him, took him or tried to take him away from the sheriff, and someone shot him through the heart, which may have been a blessing because at least he wasn't tortured. Well, it started a lot of violence throughout the community. For some reason, the men who were in charge of this unlawful activity, they used it as an opportunity to go after other Black men in the community. They actually had a poster they put around town that said, these men, were to be kicked out of town. They could not come back, and they had until 12 o'clock the next day to leave town. And they signed it, the whites. But everyone knew who these men were. It wasn't everybody in the community, but everyone knew who these very powerful men were because they were in control of Iberia. Well, for some reason, they targeted Reverend Byron Gunner, and they targeted who was the founding pastor of St. Paul Congregational Church, who was also the man, nationally known figure eventually, but he's also the man who came here with a vision for a preparatory school for the Black families, the freedmen and their families. And it was to be called Howe Institute, which he actually was able to create. He was able to establish it. And there was a lot of support for that school among Black and white citizens, but there were also some whites in the community of that democratic persuasion who didn't want to see it. They didn't want to see this particular school because it was advancing advancing the Black population too much. There were children going to the school, but there were also adults who had previously been denied legal access to literacy. So they wanted to learn how to read and write. They were getting wages. They wanted to learn how to count their money. And they wanted to learn how to read those contracts that they were being forced to sign under that Freedmen's Bureau. When Sammy got into trouble and caused this huge uproar in Iberia, the church was attacked. Actually, in 1870, I don't want to give you the date, but during that period, the church was burned. So the church that exists now is the second church that was built on that property. But before any of this happened, Pastor Byron Gunner, with his vision and with the leadership of his teachers that he brought in from around the country, as well as some people here, including Samuel Wakefield, who was the father of Emma Wakefield, the doctor who I told you about. He was able to get this school, Howe Institute, started. When Sammy killed this gentleman, when this violence happened in Iberia Parish, they kidnapped him, or rather, he knew they were coming to kidnap him. They beat him, but then he escaped. He went to New Orleans, and he never returned. But the school continued to exist. So that church is very important in the history of Iberia Parish. I talked to some of the church members, and I asked them if they knew anything about this, and they didn't. They don't know anything about the history of their particular church. But when I found the charter, I gave them the charter. I showed them who the men were, because it was men, as with all these charters. I gave them the charter. I showed them who the names of the men on the charter who had been really prominent historical figures here in Iberia's African American community, starting with Samuel Wakefield, who was the president of their trustee board. They could not believe it. And I'm thinking, how is it that you are members of this great church that figured prominently in Iberia's early history and you know nothing about it? And one lady said, Phoebe, if I'd known this, I never would have voted to give up my church congregation, because the congregational church that once stood there no longer exists, because the membership dwindled. That Great Migration took a big toll on a lot of the churches in this area. A lot of people left. The churches began to close down. That church physically, the second rendition of that church physically still exists, but it's under another denomination, which is fine. But that particular church today, the only thing they know about St. Paul Congregational Church and the people that came here and the bravery of the pastor and the officers and the early members of that church is because of the research we have done. So we are going to put a historical marker in front of the church. We did put one where Howell Institute stood, which is across the street, which is where the courthouse is. But we are going to put one commemorating that church. Brings me back to those other churches in our Descendant Churches initiative. The main thing that we want to do, as I said, is to preserve the memory, the existence of those churches. We have found that many of those churches can't find any charters. Some of them have charters, but that's no reason to deny them historical markers, because you have to prove to the state the certain things, like it was founded in the 19th century. Well, if you don't have any documentation showing that, they're going to do a lot. I get a lot of pushback. But there are other ways that this can be done. First of all, these churches, the architecture tells you that these were early 20th and late 19th century churches. We put in applications for two of the churches with the Descendant Church Initiative, St. James, formerly of Weeks Island, and Mont Carmel. I'm looking at you guys, of Patuville. And so I think that the state is going to approve those markers, but even once those churches disappear, the markers are going to be there as evidence that they existed and that those Black communities also existed. So going back to the archive, many of these churches, as I said, have missing records, or they have records that don't exist. And even though I've gone to courthouses here in New Iberia, but also in St. Mary Parish, because part of Iberia on the east side was part of St. Mary Parish prior to 1868. Those churches have no records, some of them. So I've had to make arguments as to why it's important to rely not just on these church charters. The other thing is, some churches had records, but the church families didn't know how to take care of those records. They have pictures of their old pastors that are on the walls, and some of those churches have burned down, and there are no copies of those pictures of those elderly pastors, those first pastors. So what we want to do is to teach them how to build their own archive and how to preserve the archive physically, but also digitally. And so that's one of the things that we are doing. And but the goal is to get the church members to do it. Some of the churches have indicated that, well, we had, a collection, we had records, but Sister so-and-so was in charge and she died. And our home is now locked up, and or it was locked up, and we can't get anyone to give us the records. Another church, they indicated that the gentleman who was the secretary of the church, again, he died. He did a very good job taking care of the records. But when he died, his sons were in charge. One of the sons, that's why I can't tell you the name of the church, demanded that the church pay him for the records, which they refused. So it makes me angry, but I probably still would have paid him. Anyway, so again, it's the history of the churches that are really sometimes documented, verified in those early church records. I was reading I'm sorry, I can't even remember the name, but anyway, many of the Civil War veterans, those young men who served in the Union Army and the Union Navy, when they came back to Louisiana or to New Iberia, because many did come back if they survived the war, they became the leaders in their community. Like I think I have so far 7 of my ancestral grandfathers who were either Union Army or Union Navy. My Union Navy ancestor, great-great-grandfather, was only 11 or 12 years old. He was a cabin boy, and he received his pension. I always think this is a win for him. He received his pension until he died at 89 years old. So he didn't get a lot of money. As we already know, a lot of those Black soldiers and sailors did not get a decent pension, like at least like the white. It wasn't equal to the white veterans and sailors. Just bear with me. My handwriting is terrible, so you have to forgive me. Anyway, so there are traditions of those churches that we need to be aware of too. You know, and again, having grown up, especially in those Baptist churches, listening to the way those Baptist ministers preach, the structure of the Baptist churches is something that is just, it's in my bones. I mean, my father was a deacon. His father was the head deacon of their little tiny rural church, Zion Travelers, at the corner of Darnell and Admiral Doyle. He ordained all of his sons, and he had 5 sons. And some of them became the head deacons after his passing. His wife, my grandmother, became the mother of the church. So here's the thing that points to the organization of those little rural churches. The pastor was at the head of the church after God, but the pastor also had his deacon board, and he had this head deacon who he was able to give orders, recommendations to. And what these deacons did in the Black Baptist churches, they selected, or that head deacon usually selected someone to lead the prayer for each one of those services. And so I grew up hearing my father and his brothers and uncles with these prayers. Now, a lot of these men, even though my father was a very bright man, he came from a farming family. And so after 4th grade, 3rd, 4th grade, they had to leave school so they can go and help their daddy on his farm, because that was the way they survived. So my father didn't read as well. He could read, but he didn't read as well as others. And there are a lot of those other old men who were on those deacon boards. They were so faithful and they had such joy. Church was their joy, but they could not read. A lot of these pastors could not read, especially in this area. They memorized the Bible. And when they spoke, it was as if they were reading it. You could feel it in your bones when they spoke. Same thing with my father and those old deacons. When they prayed in this area, and again, I don't know, for those of you who know what I'm talking about, there was a formula to the way they prayed those deacons' prayers. Sometimes the deacons, my dad would get up when he was pointed to pray. He would stand up and then he would kneel in front of his bench. And then he would lead, he would pray. And when he prayed, it almost sounded like it was poetry. And I can still hear him. He would always start, "Oh God, oh Lord, here I am, my Lord, your most humble servant. It is once again that I stand before you." And he would go on. And all these old men, to me, they had the same kind of rhythm, the same kind of poetic voice as they led these prayers, or as they prayed for the congregation. And they ended the prayers almost the same way. And so that little kids in these churches grew up memorizing them and saying the prayer sometimes with these old deacons. And some way I can look back and say this was a way that kept these children connected to the church. The founding church members also, or the church members also included mothers of the church, elderly women. My grandmother, who died at 100 years old, and who always went to her church dressed in white and with her hat, her beads, etc. But she was the mother of the church, and she was the one who was the leader of the women. And she had a lot of respect from those women. There were the missionaries. There were the deaconesses. So these churches had their own organization, their own structure. The little country churches that I know of here in Iberia, going way back, when you walked into those churches, the women sat on one side and the men sat on the other side. And the women, if they had little children, they sat with their mothers. St. Thomas Baptist Church in Nicotown was like that. Zion Travelers and some of the other country churches that I've been talking about, they were much like that. They eventually changed over the years, especially as I got older. But usually the women sat together. I still don't know what that was about, but that's tradition. That's tradition. When, again, let me go back to the archives. There's a church that is in Olivia, Louisiana. The church burned. It was an old church from the 19th century, Little Zura Baptist Church. It had some marvelous old pictures on the wall. You know, those bubble photos, pictures, and marvelous old pictures. And I have talked to people in the community about digitizing or making, at the time, making copies of their pictures. And they said, yeah, we're going to get to that. And they never did. So the church lost those pictures. But through the Descendant Churches Initiative, what we're hoping to do is to get church members to start doing the digitizing. Now, we can't do it all, but we can work with the pastor, we can work with the church leaders and have them come to the center that we have upstairs and do the digitizing, or at least work with the people who are in there doing the digitizing. And then we give them their pictures back and they get a digital copy of whatever it is we scan. And so there will always be a record, and there will not be the refrain or the message that we lost everything. There was a fire, or brother so-and-so took it to his house and now his kids won't give it back to us, or they can't find it. The church will continue to exist. So where are we going with this? We are hoping that once we finish this project, we're going to go, we have the first two churches, St. James, Mount Carmel and St. James of Lydia. We're hoping that we can get those church members who are very motivated to learn how to do their own genealogy so that we can connect them to those early founders. And we have some who have already, well, the pastor, Reverend Jenkins, is already doing family history and trying to connect the founders of his church to the current members. We also, thinking of him, we also have been working with doing the interviewing of these, so we can have a collection of interviews with these elders in the churches. And again, some of them are like in their 80s and 90s, and yet they remember growing up in those churches. You know, when I did the applications for the historical markers, I received a call. And the lady that I spoke to, we worked well together, but her concern was, well, Phoebe, you just don't have a charter. I have to be able to give these LSU professors something so that they can see the evidence that these churches existed when you said they did. Well, it's the nature of these little plantation churches, as some of them are called, these little rural South Louisiana churches, that many of them, they don't have the records, right? So we have to find other ways to verify or document their existence when we say that they do, starting with those 90 and 80-year-olds, which is what I had to do. You know, talk to them and do the little interview and then use that as evidence. I had the pastor go and take, and some of his members go and take pictures of the headstones, the oldest headstones in the cemetery. Some of the tombs or the graves in the cemetery don't have headstones anymore. Now we're talking Patuville and we're talking Lydia, Southeast Louisiana near the Gulf, hurricane area, flood area. A lot of those headstones have been lost due to bad weather. We have Civil War veterans who are buried in those cemeteries. Some of their headstones exist, but they're broken, they're shattered. But we have to take pictures and we have to document that these people were members of this church. And then if they were members of the church, how likely is it that those graves that are unmarked around them are also members of the same family? And so what I do and have been doing is doing family trees. For example, Peter Jenkins was a Civil War veteran. and he is actually my third great grandfather. But he is surrounded in the cemetery by family members, including Venus, his wife. And there are some children that are in that same cemetery. So, but when I do historical, when I do genealogy, family trees, I can document. And also going to the state, I can get information or records of when these people died because their death records are online. So when we do this kind of research, we have to also extend ourselves, do a little bit more than we normally would in a situation where the church has records. When we're done with this particular project, we're going to leave each church with their documentation digitized. We will digitize any pictures, any programs, any anniversary booklets that we can get from that church. And that's going to form the digital collection. But we're also going to give them their physical copies of any records that we have back to them. And I want to pause. Jordan Richardson was our first center coordinator. And Jordan, you didn't necessarily work with this project. And so Braylon's back there too. Braylon worked with the project, Braylon Polk. But and kind of, I didn't forget you. One of the values, the joys that we have had is that we have been able to bring in talented young people who are much younger than me, who can do the legwork, and you will have 15 minutes. They can do the legwork. They also have the interest, the excitement about this research. And so meeting with these people in the community, and a lot of them are elders, it is exciting, but there's so much information that we're able to gather. So what do we learn from researching churches? We learn what slavery was like here. Again, a lot of these churches that are on these old slave plantations, you got to know who owned the plantation, right? And then there's sometimes records, and let me tell you how this worked out for Mont Carmel of Patuville. I did not find a charter or any kind of official record. Michael Wade of Appalachian University, he wrote a book called Sugar Dynasty, which I have 2 copies of. And I was kind of unhappy when I got the call from the state saying that there just wasn't enough information to verify when this church was founded. And for some reason, I went and I looked at that book, and there was Mont Carmel in the book within the history of Patuville or the Enterprise Plantation. I don't know if any of you know Patuville and the sugar plantation itself, but here's the problem that I have. Why do I have to still go through white records to verify the existence of a Black church that you can tell from its architecture, you can tell from the elders in that church and the headstones that that church is indeed a 19th century church? But I had to have other documentation. So I anticipate I'm going to have to do the same thing for all the other churches. And there are a lot of historically Black churches. And when I say historically Black, I'm talking about those churches founded 19th century, early 20th century, that we're going to have to document. So I'm using this as a learning opportunity. We have had wonderful partnerships. The Acadiana Living History Foundation actually provided the funds for us to get 3 markers. They only allowed us to submit for 2. That's okay. I'm going to come back at them for next year. But again, we didn't have to come up with the funding. We have partners that have helped us with the funding. And thinking of those partners, first of all, the National Trust for Historic Preservation and the Shadows are outstanding partners. They're our primary partners. That's why we're here. We actually have the Center for the IAAHS Center for Research and Learning upstairs, where it's primarily a public space that we are envisioning. And it's also an archive that we are building. And as I said, Jordan was our first center coordinator. Was that your exact title, Jordan? Close enough. And the idea is when the community says, but I don't know anything about this. How do I find out? How do I find information? on what you're saying about certain plantations. Well, some people have given us their plantation records that they received when they purchased, certain properties, like the Loisel plantation. And our center, we digitized those huge field books that they have given us. We have records from families who have donated or loaned us their pictures of their ancestors from the 19th and 20th centuries. Going back to St. James, formerly of Weeks Island, that church has so many prominent people associated with it. One of the earliest educators in Iberia Parish, Daniel Small, was one of the members of that church, one of the founding members of that church. And when the church was moved off the island, because the island was sold, that's another reason for us to do this work. When the island was sold by the Martin Salt Company, which bought it, I think, from the Weeks family, they moved all the families off the island, removed the homes, etc., and they removed the church, which is good. They removed the church to Lydia, Louisiana. There are now where was I going with that? But anyway, so many of those that church has people like prominent, like Beyonce. Her father grew up not in that particular church, but in the Catholic Church. Her father grew up on the island. And so Beyonce and her family, they grew up going to Weeks Island and spending time in that Weeks Island community with their family members. Actually, Tina Knowles, who wrote the book Matriarch, if you look at chapter 3, it's entitled Weeks Island. And people don't know it, but they come down occasionally for different family events. And they are still connected to the history of that little community. Again, it's about community that is important for us to remember and to recognize that these churches are evidence that those communities existed, and that Iberia's history is multicultural. It has a lot to these churches, and these little communities can tell us a lot about who Iberia was at different times of its existence. So thank you so much. And where's Adam? Okay, do y'all have any questions? Thank you.
Questions?
You talked about your personal relationship to the churches and the cemeteries. I'm just curious, like, what brought you into this work? Like, what inspired you to take on this path?
Okay. So remember I said I'm from here, and I think my family's been here 7 generations, or even a little longer, through the slave trade, right? And I can tell you all the plantations that most of my lines were attached to, and they were all sugar plantations. What started me with this? First of all, as a trained academic, I know that it's healthy to ask questions, right? And so I have found, looking at the libraries, the public spaces here, there's no information about the Africans or their descendants in the history of Iberia Parish, none, until we started this historical society. I know that from my lived experiences, but also listening to my ancestors and also finding evidence, because as a professor and a retired academic administrator, I know you can talk all day long, all that you want. And if you don't have evidence to back up what it is that you say, then you can't, people who can think they're not going to be convinced. So that's one of the things I want to do. We write, I write because I love writing. But we published a journal, because it's all about us making sure that the community knows that we were here. In 2017, about 4 years after I retired from the University of Louisiana, there was a letter that appeared in the newspaper. And it basically, the gentleman basically was trying to communicate his support of the Confederate statues and markers, which is his opinion. But he did it by first starting to review the history of slavery in this area. And using this apologist kind of a framework, this revisionist framework, he said the slave owners didn't realize that what they were doing was wrong. and they were good and decent people, but they thought that they were helping the Africans. I could not respond to that letter because the enslaved Africans were good and decent people. They wanted the same thing that the slave owners wanted. First of all, they wanted freedom. They wanted to protect their children. They wanted to educate their families. They wanted fair wages, just like everybody else got, except they weren't getting wages. So it's sort of like me confronting the lies or the half-truths that I have heard all my life growing up here. And I don't blame any one person. The only people I am mad at are the people who say that this stuff, it doesn't matter, or it never existed. They whitewash it. It does matter. It does. And you can't erase a whole population of people's contributions and lived experiences and say that you are now advancing the history of a community. What we're doing is advancing untruths. So our responsibility, my responsibility, is to use the education I was blessed to receive, use the experiences and the skills that I now have acquired, now at 72, to use them to share the truth. When I uncover evidence, when I uncover information, I want to share it. It's not enough for me just to have it. I write and I do public speaking and I read and I share. We have community history tables where people just come and meet with us wherever we are and just talk about local history. And that was happening anyway, because I'd sit in coffee shops and write in friends, because I have a lot of friends here. Well, Phoebe, what are you working on? Well, great. And if I really have work to do, if I'm working on a paper or a grant, I'm not going in the coffee shops. But if I'm in the coffee shop, it's because I don't mind having people question what I'm working on, because it's a teaching opportunity, but it's also a learning opportunity for me. So I don't know if I answered your question, but I can get excited.
When you're working with churches and encouraging them to digitize their records, is there hesitancy? No?
They're excited. The other thing is some of the other churches that have heard about the work we're doing, they want to get involved. And one of the things that we wanted to do was to give stipends, like to those church members who actually serve as master leaders, that we could then take them and go to the next church. So we don't have to, it's peers, right? It's peer training. We just don't have that much money anymore. But we can do other things. But the whole thing is to get people excited. Now, you have to understand, I grew up knowing these churches and knowing many of these people in these churches. So I know how excited folks are about, sharing their church's history. And as a child of this community, it's an honor to be able to do something that's going to help this community. So, any questions?
You talked about that large scale movement of newly freed people who were indoctrinated as Roman Catholics and then converted to Protestant.
They weren't indoctrinated. It was legal. They had to be, if they were going to, well, because we talked about this, yeah.
So what do you think are some of the elements of Protestantism that appealed to them?
I think that some of it may have been resistance. Now, I've had family members, like my great-grandmother, who I knew until 1959 when she died, and I was born in 54. Told y'all I'm 72. And she was Roman Catholic throughout her life. Her father, when I found her father and mother's marriage records, it was at St. Martin de Tours in St. Martinville. Now, they weren't they weren't living in St. Martinville, but because Iberia wasn't formed at the time, that's where their records are. That's I guess where the priest married them. But
So that's the
that was the mother church. You're right. So yeah, I think that some of it was resistance, but I also think that these Protestant ministers and the Protestant ideology began to appeal to a lot of people. And especially when you think about the traditions, the what is it called in response? Traditions which are African in nature. Wait, Adam, can you put that picture of the pew up? because I just realized it was very, very important to them. Those traditions that they were allowed to engage in where the Catholic Church may have restricted them. So this is a bench. Before I sit down, I forgot to show you this. This bench came from the Zion Travelers Baptist Church, that church I told you that is at the corner of Darnell Road and Admiral Doyle, founded about 1869, I think it is. I have their chart. I just can't remember right now. My father's church. This bench is at the Historic New Orleans Collection. My family was donated this bench by a gentleman who bought all the benches in the church. And here's my problem too. When you don't know your history, you don't value what's your artifacts. You don't value the experiences of the people that founded these church communities. My grandmother who died, my paternal grandmother who died at almost 100. She was born in 1890, she died in 1990. About a month away from her 100th birthday. She told me how her father and grandfathers and uncles, they built Zion Travelers Baptist Church. And they went into the swamp and they salvaged cypress logs and they processed them or milled them. And then they hand built these benches. Now, this stuff here, the cushions that came later on, somebody thought it was a good idea. But they hand built them. Adam, do you have the other version? Okay, so this is what I want to show you all. The benches were colored yellow, some kind of a mustard yellow. I can remember as a little girl, like maybe 6 years old, sticking my finger in some of these little holes. So I was so bored. And these people had something tradition called speakers meeting, which drove me crazy. Everybody got up and said, my determination is to see God. I used to remember it because they all said the same thing. But so I would just busy myself. But one day I was at home and I woke up and I said, I wonder what the significance of those symbols were or are in those benches. So I called the pastor who was current pastor at the time, and he sold all the benches to a gentleman not far from here. And I'm glad since he sold them to this gentleman. So I called the gentleman. I asked him if I can go and take pictures of those symbols. And he said, yes. But when I told him the story of my family, he sent me a bench in honor of my father and his family. And I found the original charter for that church. These symbols are Congolese. They are Congolese. The Historic New Orleans Collection sent people to take pictures of it. And I know that my ancestors are Congolese. My DNA says it too, Congolese, Nigerian, Mali, as well as some other stuff in the gumbo. But I often wondered if the symbols represent their memories of their home, their mother country. And this could be interpreted as Christian. This I always thought was a tree. And then until I spoke to the people at the HNOC, I didn't really recognize the significance of the ridges and the holes, which are Congolese also. So we decided as a family, because we had it in the house, it's like 16 feet, I think it is. It's too long. We decided to donate it because one of the things I know is that when people have these family jewels, artifacts, whatever you want to call them, I'm walking at them, sometimes they get lost. Like I've had pictures of my ancestors, my grandfathers who were Civil War veterans that have gotten lost to the family. So if this bench stays with us, it's eventually going to be lost. So this way, the story of the church, and I'm writing an article, one of the Sarah Duggan, and we've talked about it. I'm writing an article. Oh, thank you. I'm writing an article about the church, but from the perspective of holding on, learning the history and holding on to your church's memories through their treasures. And that includes those pastors' pictures, but also items like this. There are a lot of these little churches with hand-built pews. People just don't understand how important they are. Thank y'all so much.